Welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. Today, my guest is Francisco Paco Palmieri, who is a recent senior fellow and an undergraduate capstone faculty member at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University in New Haven. He served as the acting assistant secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs for the U.S. Department of State from January 2017 to October 2018, where he led the State Department's efforts to advance U.S. foreign policy goals in the region. He managed the successful 2018 Summit of the Americas in Peru, U.S. engagement with the Lima Group, unifying 15 Western Hemisphere democracies in a multilateral diplomatic response to the crisis in Venezuela, the reorientation of U.S. foreign assistance in support of the Colombia peace process, the formulation and adaptation of a new comprehensive U.S. political and economical Caribbean 2020 strategy for the Caribbean, the launch of the renegotiation of the 50-year-old Columbia River Treaty with Canada, and the multi-agency response to the ongoing migration challenges emanating from Central America. Francisco has also been responsible for the daily management of the Bureau's 53 overseas U.S. diplomatic missions, that is 12,000 employees, and implementation of the Hemisphere's 1.58 billion foreign assistance and 290 million operating budgets. Palmieri served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary from January 2016 to January 2017, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America and the Caribbean from January 2014 to January 2016. In this role, he was the principal U.S. negotiator on the Alliance for Prosperity plan adopted by El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mr. Palmieri also served as the director of the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs Offices of Policy Planning and Coordination in 2011-2012. He also served as Deputy Executive Secretary in the Department of State's Executive Secretariat, where he managed the flow of information to Secretaries Kerry and Clinton and coordinated their overseas travels. He has led also the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement's Latin America and Caribbean Programs Office. And he was also in Baghdad, posted there, Iraq. He managed a 1 billion program with over 1,000 employees in that area, and served as director of the Near East and South and Central Asia office in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And there is so much more I can say about Francisco Palmieri, but I'm going to stop there, and so we can have some time to entertain some questions. What a pleasure to have you here, Paco.
It's really great to be here to chat with you, Marianela.
Yes.
You know, I really do think, as you say, words matter.
Yes, and you have embraced that. So that's why, as I go through the list of possible interviewees, I'm always looking for people who have used words to advance, to create a better world. And your name, of course, was one. So tell us about your first encounter, your first moment of awareness of the power of language to create transformation.
Yeah, it's really started at a very young age for me, but it's also been something that's been a critical part of my professional experience, development, and practice. But just in our household, I think it was really significant that my mother was a Spanish speaker, and the rest of us in the house were not. This is the 1960s. I'm a young, growing a child in the United States of America, where assimilation was the rule of the day. But there was a constant exposure to language, Spanish, English, Italian on my father's side. And it was really clear to me at a young age that you had to listen in order to understand. And I think for me as a diplomat, that has been one of the most transformational elements of how and what I do. And it starts with listening to what I'm hearing. And that started because, when I was younger, there were a lot of different languages being spoken around our household.
Yeah, speaking of pluralism, right? Like you had it all. You had the Italian culture, you have the Colombian culture, and then you have the American culture with all the multiplicity. But you're saying, though, can we go back to what you were saying, the force of assimilation? How was that for you and your sense of self to be you were saying that you felt the push to assimilate, but at the same time you had all this pluralism that we are talking about.
Yeah. I think the United States has come a long way in the last 50 years. But as a 8 or 9 or 10-year-old, there was this very strong sense that, your mother's speaking Spanish and no one understands that. And this is the United States and people speak English. And it was a very strong driving element that we wanted to fit in. And for us, we internalized this. Fitting in meant speaking English and kind of pushing to the back that cultural connection that language gives you to your family background.
And now going back, what do you see about this sense of self? How is it different between Spanish and English? Because you became bilingual. Eventually, you found your way into embracing Spanish, and you have used Spanish, as a key actually to negotiate and all those things. So eventually, you embraced that. What do you think, though, is there a difference between your sense of self in English and your sense of self in Espanol?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a difference, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to use a word that has been used, I am un pícaro in Spanish. I'm a bit more mischievous, as it would be, and I think that's because as I grew to embrace Spanish as a language and to see it as an advantage in my professional desires and goals. I also felt that I was learning it as an adult. I think hearing it all my life, I had the hard wiring neurologically to advance, but I didn't have the academic study. And so often my Spanish is just kind of, diving into the water, so to speak, and not so much worried about the precise intellectual reference or expressing myself at the, postgraduate level that I've achieved academically in my life in Spanish. I think I'm much more willing to put myself out there and just be more open, less perhaps guarded than I am in English, where particularly as an American diplomat, I weigh carefully every word, every intention, nuance of my language. But when I'm in Spanish, I think I just embrace an openness, and I think it's the connection of the two that makes me effective.
And I'm wondering too, if for you also Spanish, a language that you inherited from your mother, is a little bit like the language of the heart as well. And I know your mother is a lover of words and books, and so maybe that.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. Mm-hmm. Is I do think the Spanish does come from the being, from mm-hmm. the core mm-hmm. of maybe my soul and how I feel. Mm-hmm. Whereas in mm-hmm. English, I tend to be a bit more analytical, right. And yeah.
Yeah. So you began diving into learning Spanish as a professional endeavor in college. Is that so? Tell us about what brought you into the study of political science and international work and diplomacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it goes back to the whole U.S. drive for assimilation, and I think as I was coming of age in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States was beginning to change its attitude towards assimilation. We were beginning to understand that there was a richness to the multicultural melting pot of the United States, and that by preserving elements of that in an increasingly globalizing world, it was a comparative advantage for the United States. And as I realized that I had the ability to access Spanish because of my mother and hearing it every day of my life, even though I didn't speak it, I saw it as a way to build better connections and ability to communicate more effectively and persuasively in the world, not just in my profession, and that it would open greater doors. And I think as the United States moved into a long period of heightened immigration, legal immigration from the Western Hemisphere, there were more and more Spanish speakers in the United States engaging, and we saw that as an enormous opportunity for both people coming to the United States and for Americans going to the region and for building partnerships throughout the hemisphere.
When did you realize, though, that you wanted to go into political science and diplomacy?
I think, truthfully, it was from the youngest age. My first recollection of politics is being kind of absorbed by the 1968 presidential election in the United States. And that was a very competitive election between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon. But it also came during a period of enormous upheaval and violence. Robert Kennedy had been assassinated that summer. Martin Luther King had been assassinated 2 or 3 months before that. And those were the first formative events that I have memory of. And politics, and understanding that politics was your opportunity to make an impact in your community, to help your community. I think it started there. And by the time I, was student council president and in high school, and I got to college, I knew that I wanted to both pursue the study of political science and international relations. And I didn't know if I would be maybe a lawyer or involved in political life or a diplomat, but I knew that I was going to be engaged in the public sphere and in public affairs. And so I think it's really, it's innately kind of grown. And then both my mother and father were, what we call today activists, but then they were just members, pillars of their community. My mom helping the Hispanic community, and my dad's passion for working with young people and helping build community. And when others in his family were moving to the suburbs, my father was doubling down and moving back into the inner city and living there. And that's where we were raised. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, so your early childhood was framed by these election, and then the subsequent, the Kennedy's assassination and all those things were kind of shaping ushering you into the world, bringing you into the world with open eyes, and having then parents who were such advocates for human rights and activism. That makes sense. That then by the time you chose to do something, you were influenced by that. You were shaped by that. So as you look back into your career, what are your thoughts, about the power of language, the power of words to heal, which is the premise of these podcasts, and also how words have perhaps hurt intercultural negotiations? What are your thoughts about that? What are your recollections of being in situations where that some healing is possible, and there is some hurt in the negotiation. Is that?
Yeah. I think one of the most telling words that has changed how the United States approaches Latin America and the Caribbean over my lifetime and in my professional work is there was still, at the beginning of my career, it was the end of the Cold War. There were civil wars in Central America. There was a frontline competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and communism and democracy. But one word that consistently resonated in a negative way was the American mindset that Latin America and the Caribbean was our backyard. That this was a region that, was in the back, was the backyard of the house. Something that, also conveyed a certain proprietorship over, and certainly a lack of respect. And I think what I have seen in my career is, you will not find an American diplomat now, career diplomat in particular, and any effective US diplomat ever use the word backyard anywhere in this hemisphere. Because what we have come to realize and what we have come to see, and you and I both know there's a long history of other American behavior, interventionism in the region that shapes how the region perceives the United States. And so any Western Hemisphere diplomat from the United States understands that this is not our backyard. This region is our most valued and important partners. This hemisphere, we like to say, almost exclusively, is a democratic hemisphere. In the last 20 years since democracy has really taken hold, yes, there are some internal conflicts in the region, but you don't have state-on-state violence in the Western Hemisphere. I think the last time we had an intervention in the in the hemisphere is when the United States went into Panama in 1989. And so this sense of moving away from this concept of backyard meaning less than, and partnership signifying respect, I think is an example of words that we are much more in tune with now.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because the concept of, that backyard concept is not only, minimizing, but it's otherizing, right? It's the us versus them that was, and that then the other is less than. So by the time you went to work to the Caribbean, what you're saying is that some of the, do you think the history had begun to heal somehow as the United States changed their position? Because there was a lot of, the history of invasions. I can say for the Dominican Republic, right, where I am from, and how the history of U.S. invasion was a wound that was bleeding for way into, you know, the times when I was a teenager, and there were still manifestations on the streets about American intervention. But you're saying that as the United States began to see that otherizing was not the way to go, and neither was minimizing, by the time you got there, what did you find then?
Well, you know, my career began in the mid 1980s, and the truth of the matter is, the process of healing some of the legacy issues of how the United States intervened is still ongoing. But I think the recognition that the words we used, the language we used in talking to people, both governments and general publics in the hemisphere, is really important. And that doesn't mean that there isn't still ongoing conflict. We have very conflictual and different views of the world than Cuba and Venezuela and now Nicaragua. But I do think it's been a process of the United States using language that is less paternalistic, right, in our backyard, and more respectful of the importance of partnership and mutual benefit. It doesn't mean that the United States is still is doing everything right even today, but that process, I think, began. Part of it, and this is a very controversial element, was, you know, the Panama Canal Treaty decision that President Carter made, turning over the canal back to the Panamanians. It was very controversial in the United States. It sent a huge signal to the hemisphere as well. And the other thing is, I think, for the most part, the United States has tried to use its foreign assistance now to promote development and democracy. And as the region itself has embraced democracy, moved away from dictators and authoritarian governments, I think we've also found greater common ground. But, you know, it's still an ongoing process. You don't heal those, as you said, those wounds are still bleeding for some people, and they don't heal from night to day or from the use of one word or another. It's got to be a constantly.
It's arduous work. It's because of intergenerational trauma that gets passed on, and it takes generations and generations to do the healing. And I grew up with this very conscious awareness of repudiating imperialism. If you had told me when I was 16 that I was going to be living in the United States, I would have laughed and said, no, I don't live in with the imperialism. I'm not going there. So it's an ongoing process, as you are saying. When you were posted, you went to the Dominican Republic specifically in the late 80s. So what was your experience there of the healing and also the residues of the hurt? Can you think of?
I do think one of the changes in the mid 80s was Dominican migration to the United States was beginning to accelerate. And I remember I was a vice consul, and we were adjudicating immigrant visas, not just tourist visas to visit. And you could see these pockets of areas around the United States, Lawrence, Massachusetts, Jackson Heights, in Queens, the Upper West Side of the Bronx. There were pockets even then in the Washington D.C. area, and of course in Miami and in Orlando. And the way migration works is you have path setters, you have path finders who get there. And the reason, immigration tends to be concentrated from a community to a specific community is because of that social network. That ability to navigate the new world is such a critical element for an arriving immigrant. And then they reach back and they bring people to where they are because they've begun to create that social connection. So how did that change in the US Dominican context? You saw the acceleration of people going to the United States, and there was more and more understanding of what the United States might offer an immigrant. Some of it obviously highly idealized, right? Because it's never quite, the streets are never paved with gold the way some people think they are. But internally, inside the Dominican Republic, Joaquin Balaguer was still president. I think he was on his third or fourth term of office. And there was a sense that democracy needed a push to realize some of the reasons that were given for the 1965 intervention, right? To preserve democratic experience. But you had this leader now who had been reelected a number of times. And I think there was a sense at the end of the 1980s, as the Cold War ended, that the Dominican Republic was finally going to have an opportunity to realize some of the democratic governments that the United States was hoping it could offer through that intervention. And I think there was obviously, it was never lost on me when I would drive by the university or certain graffiti, there was still strong feelings about that intervention.
Absolutely. Did you ever feel in danger there as someone who was working for the states? Well,
this was pre 9/11, and so there was still somewhat of an innocence to our diplomacy at that point. But we were trained even then to realize that no matter how much you smile, and Americans are known for being friendly and smile, that you as an American diplomat were a symbol of the US government, and that did incur and infer certain risks that you had to be cognizant of. But the truth of the matter is, I think, I don't know how you feel about it. You say you ended up here, but I felt that period of time with the accelerating immigration and the moving back and forth between Dominican communities in the US and on the island, that there was a bit of a kind of second, a honeymoon kind of, where people were really, really friendly. And I don't think I ever personally experienced any direct negativism. And that's what made my time in the Dominican Republic so memorable.
Yes. Now, you mentioned, your passion for human rights as one of the first things that got you into, the studies of politics and diplomacy. As you look back now, has that passion shifted? Is your approach different now than it was, let's say, in the 80s?
Since I spend most
in terms of focus, right? The focus of your
right.
work as an international. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because when I joined the State Department, it was during the civil wars in Central America. The assassination of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador by right-wing death squads, the killing of American nuns, these and the horrific massacres that were taking place in the region led me to want to join the State Department to fight for human rights, universal human rights, and to want to go to Central America, to be there. And I was the human rights officer in El Salvador. I feel like the work I did there was very important. I know that people who had my business card when they were arrested by various notorious police units would get the opportunity to maybe reach out to the U.S. Embassy. And I firmly believe that some of those people's lives were changed and saved because people were still being disappeared. People were still being picked up and killed in Central America. Yeah. And, going into marginalized communities, into and meeting with, social service activist organizations, meeting with the Catholic Church human rights advocate, Tutela Legal. I felt, that was really meaningful, hands-on, direct work. As I've progressed in my career, I think the difference is I'm not able to be like on the front lines of that friction, but I do think it still informs every policy decision I make. And my commitment to universal human rights shapes my approach to foreign policy. It is a fundamental tenet of how I look at a problem and how I address a problem. And as recently, on one of my trips to Belize, meeting with an LGBTQ activist who had been, beaten up, who was had a significant case before the Supreme Court of the country in Belize, meeting with him and in a public way, in a public place. When I was a deputy assistant secretary, a relatively high-level U.S. official sent a message that, the United States was watching, that this issue, this person's mistreatment and this legal case was something we were watching. And I think that's a way that I still try to make a difference.
But there is a little bit of nostalgia from not being able to, at this point in your career, you're not doing the grassroots kind of activism that you were doing through the the diplomatic means that you had. So there is a little bit of nostalgia there. And I hear you say that it also informs then the decisions you make now and perhaps the risks that you might be willing to take now in your current position.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's, you know, like I said, even now, while I can't do the day-to-day outreach, I do think when I have the opportunity to incorporate that kind of outreach on an official visit, I certainly try to do it, because it does focus the limelight on a situation, but it also informs my understanding of what someone or what a community is dealing with, and how we might be able to engage more constructively.
Yeah. And you mentioned, so the LGBTQ plus community, you mentioned that. What are the others, for traditionally the issues that the human rights commissions across the globe have been most focused at being the women's rights, indigenous people's rights. When you think about, when you look back, this trajectory of your career, what are the areas, or is there a most memorable achievement that you want to bring up here in terms of you had been that you were part of an initiative that represented a breakthrough?
Yeah, I think the effort over the last 15 years to have the United States engage more consistently on the issue of Indigenous and Afro Latino rights in the Western Hemisphere has been something I've been able to contribute to. There was a program that was established as I was coming back from Iraq in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere, that I feel like I worked over a decade to help preserve and advance. And I think the other issue that has just exploded in the Western Hemisphere is this problem of gender-based violence. We talk about women's rights, and women have made important progress in this hemisphere, this Western Hemisphere, and in Latin American countries. But it is coming at an enormous cost in terms of violence against women, both domestically in the home and outside in the wider public sphere. And there again, we have, I feel like we have worked hard to raise consciousness about these issues and to try to programmatically make contributions. But even while I was teaching at Yale University, I was teaching a class of students that engaged with the Organization of American States to look at the disparate treatment of women in the criminal justice system, specifically related to alternatives to incarceration for low-level drug crimes. And the students were able to identify significant disparate treatment against women, and to outline why enhancing access for women to alternative to incarceration options kept families in a whole and allowed women to continue to be that nurturing, important figure in the raising of the next generation of children that are out there. We didn't solve the problem, but again, it was really, I'm really proud that we were able to make a contribution in that area.
And like you said, the gender-based discrimination and struggles and, the need for the continuation of creating new policies to protect women is, remains one of the main issues everywhere. But I'm thinking specifically in the indigenous communities throughout South and Central America. Can you say, one of the things that I'm thinking, I paid a lot of attention to this dance, philosophical dance, we can call it, between the indigenous way of seeing the world and the Western world. Way of seeing, perceiving, acting, that is so is diametrically opposed, the Western view and the indigenous, right? And we have been in this dance since the beginning of our time, but one that seems to continue even with all the progress in, let's say, feminism. In Latin America, we have two feminisms. We have the Western one and we have the indigenous feminism, which is, my bias, but I think the future is there. Not that you're asking me to choose one. My question is, as you navigate these worlds, can you think of of a situation where the Western values put you in a challenging situation with language or with negotiations? Because you were, dealing with the indigenous way of thinking, and you were approaching it from the Western world. Can you think of a situation like that?
Well, I think without a doubt, consciousness about indigenous rights and respect for indigenous cultural customs is grown immensely in the last 20 years. It certainly has a long way to go, and I think ultimately the question of how women are treated in an indigenous context has to be negotiated and approached by indigenous communities themselves. It is not something, I guess what I would say, we have learned that it is not something that you can impose on communities externally. And so just as we learn to promote democracy in this hemisphere by empowering people's participation in their governance, and it's not without challenges. I think the United States and Western countries can still establish that there are universal standards of human rights that need to be observed and protected, not just by governments towards indigenous communities, but by indigenous leaders within their own communities. And there's certainly there is certainly some friction sometimes
Friction, yeah.
and how that is done.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think we realize that it is a conversation and not an imposition. It is an education of two sides understanding each other's cultural context better and avoiding always this value-laden, our way is the right way of doing it. I think that's something any practitioner of engagement with indigenous communities will tell you. You have to be acutely attuned to that. You are not once again injecting a level of paternalistic imposition on a society and a community that has its own rich traditions. But that doesn't mean that you don't help educate about, universal kind of rights.
Right. So are you saying that I can rest at ease that the State Department is aware of the need to respect sovereignty and that the language has changed?
I think sovereignty is a concept that has existed in the history of international relations for centuries now. And I think clearly, as we look to US diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere, we are acutely aware that countries have, their own sovereignty, and that the best way to engage in this hemisphere is one of partnership. I like to quote Vice President or then Vice President Biden, who spent a lot of time in the Western Hemisphere. And he said, "I'm not here anymore to tell you what the United States can do for you. I'm here to talk with you about what we can do together, what we can do with you." And I do think in the Western Hemisphere, our US diplomacy increasingly acknowledges that it has to be a partnership. It has to be with and not to or for, to use little words with big meanings.
Yes, well, definitely. I can say that meeting people like you has restored my faith and has eased my, the warrior in me that was forever, very aware of imperialism and colonialism and all the isms that I have, seriously fought against in the way I live my life and even through my writing. But meeting people like you has definitely restored a sense of faith. And I am so grateful that you agreed to this interview today. Is there is there something I didn't ask that you want our audience to know about your work and your trajectory?
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember is in all communication, you really deepen understanding, and you deepen your own understanding when you are listening and when you are hearing the language and the words that people use, and you can think about the context of where they are speaking from. And our most effective diplomats, and the most effective diplomats anywhere, are ones who show up not with a predetermined solution, but with an open mind and a willingness to listen and find the possible. And so that's why language is so important.
Absolutely. And you know, what you're describing, at least in my world, is known as deep listening, and that comes from indigenous wisdom. So yes, that's why the faith is there in the going back to the roots and going back to the mindset that for, you know, the perennial wisdom that lies in indigenous thinking. So thank you so much, and such an honor to have you here.
Yeah, no, it's been a great conversation. Thank you, Marianela. Good luck with
Yes.
all your work and the
Thank
podcast.
you. Thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And if you find our program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion, always, always, always.